So welcome everyone. We're very happy to host Rinpoche Khenpo Sodaje today. And Rinpoche had just returned from teaching in China, and he said that he had just finished teaching on the Platform Sutra. And he was teaching it from a Dzogchen perspective, or I don't know what quite that means. Talking about the differences, but also maybe the similarities between Chan and Dzogchen, I don't know. So this got me interested, and given the interests of our students here, I thought this would be a great topic for Rinpoche to speak about. What exactly he's doing when he teaches on this famous 8th century Chinese text, and what his take on it is. I explained to Rinpoche just now in my office that in my class this semester we've been reading very early Tibetan Chan texts, which is unusual because Chan was supposed to have been run out of Tibet after the Samye debate at the end of the 8th century. But nonetheless, there are all these manuscripts right into the 10th century that show that, in fact, Tibetans continued to be interested in Chan in very uniquely Tibetan ways well after the 8th century. So, and in fact, many scholars have debated, was there a connection, was there a conversation between Chan and Dzogchen early on or not? And the tradition normally says, no, absolutely different. But this was a complicated issue early on, and so part of what I find so exciting about this is the idea that somehow this ancient history of early Chan and Dzogchen in Tibet has sort of come full circle, and they're back in conversation again in some way that we will now learn. So thanks all for coming, and thank you, Rinpoche, for coming.
Lasota, terang, dani girgan number sogot, dani nyamdo, parlojon shiaga, korko, onawala, dani garden chechi kita chicken, dani paterang dzogchen ko, dani dzogba chimbo dono zan zenan raga, dani saftan bandu sugar ko, tam rira. Rera shusonga. Tam rera shet goni na shirtang de da nyamlin ge ji chuba ge shokhe na zokchin de yang nyamlin ge shone sha na hale ji ge dene goji chimbo yo sazre. Dene ta de zang ge dan zhou li na zha ge di gong tang yin na zha ge de choi na yang ji nyamlin ge chone cha ni na hale ji 할레비 지 고아다리 침볼에 지요 산다는 디모즈들이 다 옛날양 어ፁ 다 짐직 그 로종 샤더 단 디모고 있는 나지 되네 족친나 자가 zen나 자가 니가가 노요 그디 조아데 지 디스마르 냠죠 인케나 디모즈레다 가스타리오나 되네 체르나바근데 잡주시오디 되네 니 다린다네 삼처 돌디바즈 다리지나 초고.
First of all, I'd like to thank everyone for the opportunity to be here to share our knowledge together about these subjects. And in that, as Jacob has mentioned, that we're going to be discussing the connection between the Chan, or the Zen tradition of the contemplatives, and the tradition of Dzogpa Chenpo, Hatha Yoga. And in both cases, let's say in the case of Dzogpa Chenpo, or the Great Perfection, from the point of view of practical application, then this is a very unique and significant direction, that's for sure. And so it has a very significant distinction. And likewise, for Chan, then the perspective of practice in this tradition also has its unique way of understanding how to effect this and accomplish this. So there's that part in terms of how each tradition is actually practiced from a contemplative point of view. And then there's a way of analyzing their tenets to see what the associations may be. And in doing so, we can gain some taste or flavor for the similarities. And so I will discuss about these points in brief.
다더니 이 운이나 근데 신나 조바 침복을 거나 있나요? 로무랑 때라 지 로종 갈라강점 신제. 근데 랑가양 진짜 지 냠는 거 조원을도 근데 조바 침복을 들이 시기용제. 대진도 단장 거는 정나 다리 공급송 왔다더래. 근데 다 로무랑 때라 양 지 다리 로종다는 짐지시. 다 차버도 로감이랑 드니 다리 짐도 저거나라고 당선 자나거까게나 탄진 인지게 발주 탄진 저자래 다때 전부터 드니 다 발주 롭쳤 니마 집지 알면서 그런 같은 시다나 그런 아마 지금 주존을 타마 집지 저거나라 다 디모즈래 다 디랑아야 드니 지금 장거 다리 또 마임 방금 제리오거 드니 자나거 다직 단전 그 지오 몽보즈 그 콩남비 그러러 있는 자가 송좀 있는 자가 다 다리가 뒤 상탄담 제요거도 좀 몽즈가 토슨 시니엔 되니 남아요 다리가 다 다리야노 그 되니 상탄 비르고 그 되니 좀 몽즈가 다리 스타트 시니엔.
Now speaking for myself, of course I spent many years of my life emphasizing the practice and the study of Dzogpa Chenpo. And that has been, in fact, my main emphasis in my personal practice and also in my own teaching experience. As for Chön Buddhism, I also have studied this tradition, and as Jacob made reference to that, I have been teaching the Platform Sutra. In fact, I've taught it on some 40 occasions in its entirety. And likewise to many of the great doctrine upholders in China, I've given instructions on this contemplative tradition of the Chön, and I have read their dohas and their commentaries, and I have spoken on those subjects, and I myself have contemplated them deeply.
다 상담 비점탄도 고수 소가 야르고 만도 신이나 담도 도지스죠 바당 드니 다 화원들 당인진 김도 제긴도 다리가 딱 잡아라 다리 정거 요사리 그건데 냠슬랑의 경우에 드니 도말 다 달마보도 또 콩내 종때 드니 라르 trực바 그바르도 다리가 다 치기 것을도 망업 다리 치기 것을도 용사래. 되네 다 되네 라르 죽바ser 고난 자가 다리인데 단진 좀바보 너네 종때 되네 다리가 미치기레 치기기 용은 맞다. 이나양 콩남비 플롭체 것을다네 다티바르도 되네 다리 다르와즈래. 데인디 다티바르도 양주 접토 잠마차바 접토 와마차바 쇼니고 베 추다리 잡모고 다 디모즈가 다리가 손을 디모즈 다리래.
Whatever the case may be, in terms of the Chön tradition, it seems that they take as their source for knowledge the two sutras known as the Diamond Sutra, or the Vajra Chedika, and also the Surangama Samadhi Sutra. And with this as the basis, up through the sixth lineage holder, the tradition was passed from one teacher to one student as it was transmitted. And then following that, it opened up and there were more students, and that way of transmitting the tradition, which takes as its source these two principal sutras, has been kept intact until the present day. So in other words, it has endured over the centuries in an unbroken fashion, and the profundity of the original knowledge is considered to be still intact.
다더니 조바 첨보 원도시는 조바 첨보 대요. 더니 다 토머 망가 걸고니 더니 라마 몽보고 다리 지금 기대용노. 다 디몬스터리 대네 나거나 추 원도시네 나주 다 집주든 대진도 다 당상에 나다리 홍친 조든 야지 상anga 야지 단도 초다리 자와이 기록 조 드네 다 워강쟁 거왕도 시네나 르냐마바가 다리가 축조 냠슬레니 담도당 생각하는 거 생각하죠. 생각하는 거야. 다 마하요가다 아나요가 아다요가 차가 요니는 거 조바 침본도 지 아다요가 제단 치상와 아드네 타바 탐치그 여로임 손이 다 디모가 하장 다리 잡혔다 담비 다리 추다 디모스 그 손을
In terms of Dzogpa Chenpo Ati Yoga, then from the perspective of the source of this lineage, it is a lineage that has been passed on over the centuries of time through the Upadesha instructions of the lineage teachers and their disciples. In a similar way, from the perspective of the Dharma, it is the transmission of the 17 root tantras of the Ati Yoga cycle, the 7 treasures, the Ningtik Yapshi, 7 treasures that were written by Longchenpa, the Ningtik Yapshi, the 4 sections of the heart essence tradition. These are the root texts where the Nyingma doctrine finds its source in terms of Tantra. Of course, there's Sutra and Tantra, but specifically speaking of Tantra, then that would involve the 3 inner vehicles of Maha, Anu, and Ati Yoga. And Dzogpa Chenpo, of course, is the vehicle of Ati Yoga, the king of all vehicles, or considered to be the pinnacle, because it involves the most profound instructions that are found on the path of Buddha Dharma.
다 내니 자사고 쇼면을 생존나 다 파치와도 벨나 드니 슬롭마 데라라미 망가 무추시 드니 다 릉거 르방 무송이 난다가 릉거 셈게 되니 된 무슨 송디 드니 다 상튼 빌라양 다리 슬롭마 조라토바 하장 멍보즈도 당상 드니 상튼 바창 그 추고 갑나 송원데 남터차가나 송원데 드니 다 조칭게 있나 양 조칭거 갑나 데레 망거 르반 운동 촌 손에 손때 그 뇽몽바 탐청 양스 쪼르네 드니 다리가 다 조라토바 데모다리 하장 멍수도 송원데 드니 망거 공원도 시나 양 홀나 갸나거 다직 상튼 바출 남터라 데니 키라온디 후추오다리 상위 고근에 드니 지금 다탑 라당 만자다리 홀나 다직 측다리 측지기니레 초강레 초강현제 지는다 드니 나스레 제지는다 다 때라서바 그 측가랭가레 다탑라테네 랑그 샘그 모전 거연제 드니 조바 쳔부 원더시나야 지금 남카강레 제지는다 홀나 히르도 가론도 제레 제지는다 다 때스다위 다리가 망 하장 스탑 데보즈가 때니다나 그 샘기 모도 모전서 다 때다리 추니가 그럽나 약송원들
In terms of the similarities, it's interesting to take note of the fact that both traditions of Dzogpa Chenpo and Chen which will actually emphasize the Upadesha instructions that have been passed on from the masters of the lineage, which emphasize the means through which to identify mind's nature, to recognize this intrinsic nature of the mind. And so according to the contemplative system of the Chun, then that would mean many methods that are part of that transmission that's been passed down. And we know this because of reading the biographies of the masters and studying how it is that they transmitted the teachings for introducing mind's nature directly. And in Dzogpa Chenpo, it's also very similar. So these are 2 important similarities. The introduction of mind's nature so that a disciple knows basically how to meditate upon that. For example, in Dzogpa Chenpo, bringing it to the point where the disciple is able to release all conceptuality into basic space so that they then can attain liberation. So from the perspective of the Upadesha, transmission instructions for pointing out mind's nature, in the Chen tradition, then that may be by using few words, which are referred to as koans, such as, who are you? The disciple asks the student, and the student asks, who am I? And there is a process of investigation which is highly simplified but pithy. in few words, little rhetoric. In Dzogchen, we would find similar ways of introducing where is the mind's nature in space, or gaze at the crystal to see mind's nature. What can be seen? These kinds of questions are asked when the pointing out instructions are given. Now, these are very applicable methods which allow a disciple to be introduced to their mind's nature in a direct way.
다 있나요? 근데 다위 지금 우측 거거다나 대신도는 지금 망가 거건도 소 드는 것수 랑커 그 짐직 봐 똑게와 단 내초가 드니 랑커 그 회창가리 라테이다나 또 고알렌게다나 담네 다리가 지금 다 랑거 다리가 지금 나톡 거고 파 샤팔 잡지기나 다 추 땅즈긴데 티 남반 가리가 다 된다 짐직시 용용네 메네 메시다나 shirna nyamlin birkor ke chunda dana tene jimjik birkor ke chu gellam lam de tariga parchir ji khakana ra ji mandawan ro changdo yo re tene na tene ngachu mao ne kamna je chunde la jimjik shege de ne na shirna chum tombo nyamlen 근데 jimjik shena tejik gyonchen zigdana tejin de jimjik shena jimjik tene htang 다 푸드비 용전을 티모 네테나 요노마르 산 쫀진 마인데지 상한 형어지기도 상 거기대야나 직대라 쫀주요되는 그 딱선 거야 있는 말이다 있나요 단디 망거 되니 단 조스탕도 이하즈 마코니 존테 뭐수 땅선 거 다리가 지 플롭자와 거 다리 플롭마초다나 게르근 소거 회나 조바 침보라 짐직신가 하장 망보 요너다 있나요 그런 좀 조스탕을 뜨거 then zoba chimbu manga qhtang chirta ajenda qubala hajang tarong thrambo yo kare.
So then this manner of introducing mind's nature through the transmission of the upadesha or pith pointing out instructions. Now when the intellectuals review this process, that is to say, those who are mainly studying the scriptures from an intellectual perspective, because they're using the conceptual mind to do so, then it can't be said that the depth of that spiritual transmission, that the pith point of that spiritual transmission is going to be understood by them because of using a different approach. You see, because there are two different ways to transmit the Dharma, from the point of view of contemplative inner realization and from the point of view of analytical mental development. And so, because these two approaches are so different, this has to be taken into consideration. And that's why in the future, if only the analytical process of mental development is applied to the study of the profound scriptures in these two lineages, then it's hard to say if that intellectual pursuit is going to even approach the depth of that study. And also because it's not because the lineage is faulted in any way at all, but according to the secret essence teachings, they need to be kept secret or unexposed for certain reasons, not because they are faulted. It's a self-contained secret, which is what is meant by that an intellectual pursuit cannot possibly hope to even approach the inner understanding or realization of the depth of these doctrines.
근데 로르지 원더신이나 네 상담 받아는 되니 다 오진 나왔던 거 같아 되니 소파양 침보 쇼용너래 다 다리 보진 나왔던 거 나나 되니 다 다리 사미 그 소파제기 단 나오는 거 다 잡제가네 사미 그 소파제기 디모용 쇼용너래 디모 쇼용지도 다 파르치르나 제남반 가래 다리 당홍 거 로르지 좀 직시바 보인 거야가 되니나 되니 조 다리 네 상담 바가 되니 하상 마하야나 지긴도 되니 당홍 거 사차 다 당홍도 하다는 간수가 당선 사차들아 단디 사차가 용리 다리 로혼도 tani ngama to ta woyera yara yong tani lo parchir lo chich yarmar kan sama ta lorji ge zechur manda mombo ya ka na yana ya parchir lo chich yarmara tani chuk song mare ze ta chuk song di tani nga chu woyer ke ya tani gomba ina jaga tani tawa ina jaga tani ta marcha phumo chu mombo ze kan tela gas thowe ta na choma ga tani chu te tari nyamsal na re se.
And I forgot to mention from the last statement that these days there's a tendency for teachers, professors, and also students to study these profound scriptures from an analytical perspective. And so that's why I made my point, that pursuit would keep them far away from understanding the pith point of what those scriptures are actually teaching. Now, there is also the well-known, what is referred to as the Samye debate that occurred between the Chun tradition and Buddhism, as it were. I know that many of you have been studying this in terms of studying the Dunhuang manuscripts, and so you know the history well about the arrival of Hashang Mahayana in Tibet, and there are many assertions about what happened during that debate, which is a study in and of itself, but that Hashang Mahayana stayed in Tibet for some 11 years and taught. And during that time, many of the monastics, monks and nuns, and also the lay people took a great interest to want to follow his teachings.
Nina Jima Tane Ta Wire Go Ta Mahayana Congo to Chu Taker Yamber Jortons Pernatari Chun Karu Drumnayan Drupnare Nima was a drum jordan Chun Nobu Drumnayan Drupnore they don't Dawa Chang Chukkaru Zonayan Dandare Chunho Zonayan Dandare Chamaron Jonre then the Karu on the Hogo Geva dan duga leka chester lena ya nelik ton to jo dela drubnare ne takker nyams jok kon re ze idana ta chute tarper shenre ta chute tarper shi chirondi dene wo kanjeng ga ta kunzuk geva holna tari ga ji chodme yaram choke da sham saje da na devjin da na ta ji geva drukyo go gewi ngubo monz da dene ta met songre ta tine kana dene tambar zopa jande kerne na dene jagar ga tari ga Logan Jimbo Kamashala, or Danjang, then in Yamda, Zopashi, Dana, Tate Zeftur Moyon, Ganstariana, the news on Teta, Hasamayana, then Takanjing Jungo, Tariga, Victor Meden, the young Tariga, Tata Hongo shows a Harrow to other one.
And so, as the story goes, while this Chinese master, Hashang Mahayana, was teaching, propagating his doctrine in Tibet during that time, he would teach about the Mahayana aspect of contemplative meditation, where one just simply rests in mind's nature without any other elaborations, which would cover that nature, like the way that a cloud covering, whether they're white or dark, are still both covering the sky. And that means obscurity. And so whether virtue or non-virtue is being accumulated, then it's irrelevant in terms of the fact that it's covering that nature, that capacity to just rest directly in the nature as it is. And so any kind of relative virtuous pursuit in a spiritual direction would be discouraged by him, such as presenting offerings, such as making prostrations, and the accumulation of various types of virtue. Like, for example, if a white dog were to bite you in the leg, or a black dog were to bite you in the leg, the blood is still going to be red. And so, in hearing these teachings, it came so that the practice of virtuous accumulations began to diminish. And it was around that time that the great Indian master Kamalashila was invited to Tibet to debate him. And so, in the course of that debate, and there are many different assertions about exactly what came down, it seems that Hashang Mahayana was defeated and he was exiled from Tibet.
하상 마하야나 갸나가 시라션디 콩거 람 카이드다 워이르가 학송하자 주론제 데네 당상 개방가리게세나 다 냐마와당 까르짓 바근 데네 조금 코낙조 하르 제르 곰득 존덕조 시에근데 데나 하상 마하야니 다리 함 카이드 냐마와당 까르짓 바가 데네 다리가 다 사랍랑데 그제이다남 개발라가 디모고 냠서 그까차 송노래 까르타리야나 보르도사도 다리 다모 콩 다리 그 지마양 그 다 클리 감거나 저런데 차르디다 양 싫어 총아제이다 제트론제 다 뜨디 양 다리 하미즈드 다리 코네 함카이드 그 아까이 하미 로아 그젠데 다 상튼 바즈 소지 다탑게 나다 까르타리야 야가라 싫어 송네나 야나가 싫어 송네나 함카이드 지다리 코네 요근데 기즈긴데 디 템즈르니 시금에.
And when Hashang Mahayana returned to China, as the story goes, he left one sandal behind. And there are many who said then that this established, since before he left this one shoe or sandal was left behind, this made the interdependency for the Nyingma and the Khargyu lineages to have and to emphasize contemplative placement in mind's nature. And that this was similar to what happened with Bodhidharma, who ended up dying in China, but that later it was when they unearthed his coffin, they found that there was but one sandal in the coffin, and another master had encountered him wearing just one sandal in another place. And so whatever the case may be, if it was setting forth the interdependency for that to occur, that the Nyingma and the Khargyu would emphasize that contemplative aspect of practice or not, these are some of the notions that are present even today.
다 상튼 바츠 칠남반다나 잖아가 데 상튼 바츠 최냥지요네다 shirna kunga chumta gwanda shena chikchirwa zida rimgiwa zini yonze. Dende da chikchirwa ga da kunga sangtambi chuga nana shena chula dari ga chikchirda rimgiwa she mes. Yina ya gansagla dari ga chikchirwa da rimgiwa ga ya she yo. Dene da rimgiwa da dari wangbo tarwo yin. Chikchirwa da wangbo numbo yin toksongze. Da to yindi ngune ga jiga chagi woyir ga togmaar dari kozong shperin jogyo 직치를 쳐. 타거가 그 하는 적도 없는 막도 되면 개와 강양 모주지기 띠 발치 추 연사래. 다 땅상 야나나 있나요? 토마 년내나 개와 내가 찌엄 없음 배나 타거가 주방 가리게는 적도 되기래. 따때이나 왕보 하정 랍 되니 다 왕보 nom보 디모 왕도 시나 추대 프로듀션 바래. 레타나 왕보 럼기와다나 왕보 뜨르고 다 땡자위 강사가 있나? 대 하정다리 닌카치 다 라운전스 그 송원제.
And also for the Chan Buddhism, the contemplative meditators, then there are two aspects to the philosophy or the tenet, and that involves two types of acumens in terms of individuals who practice. Those who are referred to as the instantanealists and the gradualists, the Chikcharwa and the Rimgipa. Those who instantaneously realize, those who gradually develop. Now, these two distinctions are not found in the doctrine, but the distinctions are applied not found in the doctrine or present in terms of the perspective of the teaching, but apply according to the acumens of the individuals. And so it's from that perspective that individuals are considered to have keen faculties. Then they would be the instantanealists, or those who instantly realize that they have this capacity. And those who are considered to be more dull would be the ones who must gradually develop, or the gradualists. And so in Tibet it seems that initially most of the practitioners fell into this first category of being the instantanealists. And this is also true even these days in China. There are many who are still teaching that from beginningless time, one only needs to instantaneously realize, wake up to, or awaken this innate nature in order to be set free. But if you take this capacity for those of keenest acumen, and you compare that to those who are more dull and incapable of accomplishing in this way, then it becomes very treacherous for those who are gradual developers. It becomes a dangerous path because they're incapable of accomplishing this.
Saktan baga chu the tene ngone ji ta ramji baga wang de shene na dansang yang ji tartib chewan zhe ge song zhe dansang yang tartib chewa zhe ge song zhe de na dan de ngama onupchin sarji yi shi ngoror bo che ge lobma chimbo jimba nyengi yajir ta khonggup sangtun mugdun zera zhe de tari song zhe dan de be hajang tari ge zarchin zhe 니 능나 다리 총거 파르처 다 레고 jer yarmariyo sare di nang lega da jiba ndo soyina 다리 상tum bago tani rimgiwi lamdo shat tani legar ngabi nerkamna jikchirwi lamdo shat tani da jigba da damba shima chunana tani ngaq irkor danar zokching irkor da te so rimgi 다리 sonje dan dotsu nanga 다리가 jimmo tajizina 파르처 ngso 당상 잔제거나 상తం 바도 다 다리 흥역이 있는 거야 지 시절거 응원주 쇼스 또다 다 도쇼거나 친 토사가 다리가 드니 다리 추 디모즈가 원정거 차례 삼지고 디모여거.
Now also in terms of the doctrine of the Zen or the Chan Buddhists, these days, interestingly, the gradualist tradition has become quite widespread, and that's due to the fairly recent discovery of Nupchen Sangye Yeshe's text, who is one of the famed 25 disciples of Guru Rinpoche, the Sumden Mikdren, in 8 chapters. And in this text, the 4th chapter deals with the subject of the gradualist approach. The 5th chapter deals with the subject of the instantanealist approach. The 7th also deals with, the 5th, the instantanealist approach. The 6th and 7th chapters deal with the subjects of mantra and Dzogchen Ati Yoga. And so, in terms of that, then this contemplative tradition is really emphasizing the pith points of the higher preliminary studies and practices. And so it is something that really is surpassing just sutra development.
단디 왕들시나 ngotsu 강정금 케바 탐측거는 네 상점 바다 죽친 먼저제 송원제 그러나 금chen 직면랑바 공거양 송원제 도접친거 양 송원제 드니 다리 다 지문편은 뭐지 공거양这个니바占满 하상lực lang통 사리 참매배 천원 도진 견나르네 뜻송원제 치르제니나 공격송지의 다 상동 공교대란 조금 셋금즈단 조금들 거스 다 토만 있네 말은 적동지에 있네나 대다리가 다 하신 걸 그랬어 다 하신 걸 늑대라 드니 lang통 극사라 드니 랑아 지니 코나 막독제면 디 생기 ngô 저다진 시키거 드니 lang통 그러나 lang통스지도 다 지름보체가 랑름 침부갑나요 지네다 lang통 송원제 금친 침보가 샘령 알수갑나요 지네다 lang통 종지도 다리가 송원제 다 띠다비 lang통的 매총의 종때 드니 다 그러나 초능을 동방상는 막독제면 그거 단 대때니 그 타라당 탐진기 믿고만 도고나 하전가가 제이다 다 거봐요 뭐 송원제.
And so what that means is that if you compare this with the sutra studies, then this falls more into the category of mantras approach. And so that could be called the ultimate teaching for sutra, which means it is a presentation that's going into the category of mantra. Now, many of the Tibetan scholars also have mentioned that there are not just only these similarities that I've brought up, but that there are grave differences, which point to the fact that Dzogchen and Hashang Mahayana are not the same at all. For example, some of those great masters who have made these claims are Jigme Lingpa, Dodok Ju Mipam Rinpoche. Ju Mipam Rinpoche mentioned in his Ngeshi Rinpoche, quote, "The second is the tradition of Hashang involving non-thought. Lacking Vipassana's clarity, remaining like that is like a rock stuck at the bottom of the ocean." And so when he makes reference to the second, there are the two categories of meditation, analytical meditation and placement meditation. And so this placement meditation, the second, is the tradition of Hashang, involving non-thought, and lacking Vipassana's clarity. So reference to that means that Hashang basically taught only shamatha meditation, without emphasizing penetrative insight or true seeing, which is the Vipassana complement to that accomplishment of peaceful abiding, shamatha, tranquil stillness. And so, therefore, without any Vipassana or penetrative insight clarity, then just remaining in peaceful abiding is like a rock stuck at the bottom of the ocean. The time for liberation will never occur. Now, James Tsongkhapa, he also taught that one must practice both in a state of non-duality. Also, the great omniscient Longchenpa and his Sending Arsal, resting the mind in comfort and ease, he taught the same. And so the points that they were making are based on the fact that if one's just going to rest in tranquil stillness, there will be no capacity to actually achieve the state of liberation from the confusion of cyclic existence. And so they refute the system altogether based on that premise.
Tati zo dari zoba chimbo da manjawa saryang dari der songje. Reta na tayang tartu gerta yongdo shina, tartu gerta yongdo shini na yang ta chu hajang zabmo ta timonzu da songje. Chirezena 금친 침보 홍친 람점 그 오늘금조 그 레가 땅을 감나 더니 다 하상 마하야니 다리 공바도 데티지 똑게와 남지 다리 콩도 마숑 아래 되면 돈도 때스터 네소세 이다는 더니 시르나티 오늘금나 까르너글린 디비 김제 까르너글린 디비 다리 더니 친 토비 조바 침보 스타 다리 조바 침보 담스 다리 샤피아네 급더리 다 티능나 다리가 공거제나 다 연계 뛰어내급나 다리가 다 똑게 완가리가 그 마스톡너를 제면 동거던 거 되니 하신 그 공바대야나 동거던나 테스트 옛날에서 이야 다리가 송은데.
And so we can see that the Chan tradition is also not similar to the Dzogchen tradition in terms of the point that was just made, but also one must then introduce the absolute view and how it's different from that perspective as well, the profundity of the absolute view. And in terms of that, the omniscient Longchenpa, he mentions in the first chapter of his treasury of the fundamental nature, or treasury of the way things are, Neluk Rinpoche Zut. He mentions that the intellectuals did not understand the ultimate meaning of Hashang's teachings. And so at that particular time, because they were unable to understand the ultimate meaning of Hashang's teachings, then it should not be fully rejected. One cannot fully reject Hashang Mahayana's tenets if one was only approaching from an analytical perspective.
다 하상 마하야나서 이제도 땀 개바 하자 다리 침보 인사가 깡스타리오는 다나 네 점탐조래와 점탐조 끝감나 다리 대금지 홍신 바고 송래 치레제오르제나 더니 야거그 그 화날은 잘그 다 지금 강한 매 마셔 공아 더니 쪼고 다리 그 담도르데 냥데다나 도르데 파로체다나 대전도는 다른 너와롱 단데초 다리가 데니 니망 주제근데 기 로자와디 다리 야나 퍼카다 게너레스 데니 지마 다리 베로자나다는 락사나 라소베 그 하상 마하야네 라틴니 그거다 그러나 뭐이르거 추가 야른 결용으로지 뭐 결용으로 송어 다티 마하야난도 데니 다리 상튼 마하야나 연는는 그 개바수 사카 탁 줘봐요 말했다나 그건 다리야 맞수 로지가 나왔대 저런데 다 야나가 다리 콩남에 송르즈래 다 디럽 야빠다나 디럽 다리 적니 바야르면 그 스캅나 데네 야나가 다리 쾌바 몽오가 상튼 바성금 쾌바 대동나 데네 다 워이르가 다리 쾌바 남지 데네 땀발라 다리 샤르게 침부시오노 몽서제.
And not only that, we also have to take into the consideration, because it's worth noting, that some sources say many of the Mahayana Buddhist scriptures were translated into Tibetan from the memory of Hashang Mahayana. And so, for example, again, Longchenpa writes in his Drupda Rinpoche Zut, which is the treasury of philosophical tenets, another of the 7 great treasures. He says many sutras, such as the Avatamsaka, the Mahaparinirvana, and the Vinayagama sutras, which were translated into Chinese by Nima Mudrup before they were burned at Nalanda Monastery in India, that they were also translated into Tibetan by Vairocana and Ba Sangshi from the memory of Hashang Mahayana. And so, rather than rejecting the Hashang scriptures based on the philosophical tenet, one has to appreciate how these Mahayana texts were brought from Chinese into the Tibetan language and had a pivotal role from the 8th to the 12th centuries in terms of Chinese scholarship and how it affected the Tibetan understanding of Buddhism.
딱 조치사다 동립 그건데 따나다리 와비오 사례 다 되네요 다리 근데 다리디 다리짐도제나 단진제나 디난소이나 되네 탕 몽은 참나 샘거랑진 우억사라데 하장다리 짜르다 돈이 샘거랑진 우억사란다 맞추 다리가 다 조바 첨부 다 망각되고 샤파타비요 사마레다 옛나요 지 샘르데다는 디모그 감나 샤파고 되네 다 샘기 우억사란다 다리가 짜르다 돈이 샤디오차 양치망르 실나요 산지 그 춘도 샷고네 종때 소가 와르와가네 그나 때님 공부 흘러접고 지스타와진 덕다나 와파 스타르트 때니 스토완인도 다리 꼴고지도 하장까지가다 때니까 타면 이렇게나 때니 야츠 샴밤 공부 다리 길와만라 소바그까나 덕다나 와파 스타르트 우억사란다 때니가 거래 다 때니가 마인 바가 샘기 라우진 ngor tongwa yin ba rangjin go sarwa dan denika shuksu trasone zonte daga sanji ge gomba yang yahaz de go yo namare sanji ge gomba mo go ji de ngatsu ramnyung go yang konje ngatsu rang jimjig ba yin na sem ge sema te jironde sem de dari ngor tongwa zin no ramnyung go konje deyang ngor tongwa de namkar ta ba rang shang chapaz ma no deyang rang sema te di yang sar sar jinji ru ru na ba jan zi yo no deyang dari konje ta de yin ni jironde 맞수 다리가 네 상튼 비겁나라 사스통 니메가 다리 이신도 하장 다리 사카잔 송요너레
However, when I examine the inner philosophy of the Chen tradition, then most certainly the principal emphasis is to establish the realization of emptiness, that the nature of mind is empty. And as it describes in the Platform Sutra, that the intrinsic nature of mind is luminous, or is cognizant. Now, that description of cognizance is not like Dzogchen's Upadesha class's description. However, it is similar to the mind class descriptions of Ati Yoga. And so keeping that in mind, then this becomes a crucial point for understanding how this is in fact an authentic path that can lead one from the confusion of cyclic existence can lead one to the state of liberation. Because it has to do with the two great sources for learning. Nagarjuna's emphasis, such as in the Madhyamaka Karika, whereby the fundamental nature of mind must be known, and Maitreya's emphasis on the Uttara Tantra, whereby the mind's nature, the capacity to be cognizant and awake as Buddha, must be known. And so that empty nature and that intrinsic luminosity or cognizance, without these two aspects, it would be difficult to imagine that the wisdom intent of the state of awakening could be ascertained. Therefore, by understanding the mind's nature to be empty like space, when the apprehender, the mind itself, looks into itself, then this clarity or this cognizance of the knower is rendered evident. And according to the Chen tradition, it's very clear that this aspect of wisdom cognizance as the nature of emptiness has been ascertained.
Tatangsan de ni mambo zukutane zoba chembola yang jimjik shekeyore. Tane zang gutari churkur kurkora yang jimjik shekeyore. Tang ngi ngoni rewa ina tane taranga ngi janak tane chokbo choda nam kheba cho mo jim yongwa. Kozo ina ta jimjik shekito ji khwernam do shok jong jandang jan te shene na hajang yobo reze. Ngak shok ta janak zang kurkora ji wang tu go ji dan tane ji sta mani ji sawa yin ji de nyongshi re gari yo ji zre. Tangsang ta dir gomba gnang na tare nyama dangaranga tare zanga tene gom kya ta teso ina yang ma jamba yong ma chog jina dak sangwa ga timo yon re te mak to chimbo yong mar da nga chu wok te zoba chimbo ur kor yin na tan de ji rangkhar ko jimji ko tene ja da tsig lam go ndo shi ni na ta yabu mo yong ji mo bo zu to song re te ni na nga chu to ze yo jimji shi nam do shok ko jong mo bo la jimji shi na ha jang yago re yin na yang ngak shok ko ji nyamnen gor kor chyi gor kor 단 디모츠 tene 당성 tene 지 쾌바 몽보고 샤브조고 이게 회나 먹름 바인나 자가 짐직 바인나 자가 거근 쳔모이나 자 디모츠고 tene 딱조 샤좀 그는 abjagetan 또 다때 다리가 삽짓 뭐 랑거 작 tene 탁가다 만탁가 ze이다나 나토고 때 샤파 뭐 지르지나 당 닝원이 있나 다리가 때 타박단님이
And one hope that I have that I very much wanted to share with you here today is this tendency to make philosophical comparisons with the Dzogchen doctrine and teachings from an intellectual perspective. And I've shared these views of mine with many of my Chinese colleagues in China and in Tibet. And of course, we all agree that any study of the sutra and any attempt to base one's thesis on the sutric scriptures is absolutely permissible and appropriate. But when it comes to the direction of mantra, I would have to say, even from the perspective of the Chen tradition, although it's certainly not as far-reaching as Dzogchen's Ati Yoga tradition, they do have their secret ceremonies, rituals such as 7 days of cloistering, where they're not allowed to leave or enter, and this is meant to be kept sacred, not in a vast way, but there are different kinds of sacred ethics that apply to that tradition that have to be respected. Now, all the more so in Dzogpa Chenpo, it is never a good idea to try to analyze or to teach or to make comparisons with this doctrine out of the context of the lineage tradition. And so if you are interested to do that for intellectual study, you should do it with sutra. But it should not be done with the mantra materials that have to do with practice and commentaries for the benefit of gaining a PhD degree, or for teaching students in an academic environment, for writing a thesis, etc., etc. For me, I disagree with that approach.
다 홀나 조바 첨부 짐직쉐기기나 지 솜큰거 라마르 남거 남터리 난자가 다니 로르지가 쇼이 난자가 따뜻 마인 바가 지금 적중거 종을 끌거 데라야 망거 끌거다 종을 끌거 녀제 다니 종을 끌거 너 초지 다 지금 짐직 갈아간섬 시기 잔지나 니바 첨범 종지 말했삼거 따뜻 마인 바가 다니 적춘 톰몽 랑끝 거네나 추망보즈도 송원제 단 대초다리 나츠 롭자는 거 드네 짐직시나 나 오빠즈 임비 차게네나 나라다리 문튼 메이커 다다nga 나는 다 따로 나 아메리카에 드네 가사카네 나 롭자 망보즈가 송나 당보 기르근 남바 속에나 보이 여보 시간도 워크 여보 시간도 할레체 그 가서 첨보숑 이나요 기르근 가레그 드네 워크 보그 춘데라 전족다나 콩남바가 냠레 여보시 냠레 ರಂ게야 냠레 여보시 드린도 가레그 다 짐직 코나 다리가 셰근도 깡타리야나 마츠 짐직 시나야 라와레 냠레 시나야 라와레 제탄 가스티 내라 데 짐직다 샤더 쉬기 잔지 있나 마츠 워이르거 라마남거 적춘거 다리가 이견도 소 있나 로종 시피 내급나 코로나데라 소진 많이 봐서도 요늘에 티 소진데라 전적 쉬기도 하장 가르쳐야 삼가 그러나 나이나 야능이 난자가 인지 난자가 드니 나우 이거 이게다 저기 강랑 로종 시내나 코로나 다리가 드니 다 소진 난자 공시 난자가 대전도 코로나 졸릭데라 드니 기거다 전적 다리 쉬기요 다 대인디 드니 오늘 지금도 닝오니나 따탈롱에 롭찬데네 다 요요지 마르게 좀 사로 고금에다 다 롭차 잔다 잔바 속에나 배 멍보다는 통송들 땐 통도 지 라마르가 라마 속은 통요지래다 강 다리오나 다 지마다롱 다롱이 니 타다다리 소모몽던 거요.
If one wants to research the Dzogchen tradition, then I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. But it would be advisable to base your research on history and on biographies, autobiographies, and to keep it to those kinds of areas. If you were to base research on the comparison of the different tantric treaties in an appropriate way, that also may be acceptable, not so harmful. But it mentions in Dzogchen's own tradition and scriptures that there are many guidelines and there are many rules, as it were, or words of honor associated with the Upadesha tradition of Dzogpa Chenpo. And this is something that needs to be respected and upheld. Otherwise, there will be repercussions. So it's something to avoid. It's not at all necessary. If one wants to learn a tradition, one needs to learn how that tradition is meant to be approached and dealt with. And in this case, it is inappropriate to use that secret material that's based on the prerequisites of receiving the lineage traditional transmissions, how to use it appropriately. And so for myself, I mention this because last year and also this year I've visited many schools in the United States, Canada, and other countries. And it makes me really happy to meet the professors who are able to read and teach Tibetan, and students who are studying the Tibetan tradition and speaking the language. But I've also noticed that there may be some inappropriate research going on in terms of the secret traditions out of context. So I wanted to caution people that this is a lineage tradition, and research and study of the tradition should be done according to the lineage in an appropriate way. That's how it always has been, and that's how it will continue to survive in the world. So to treat it with respect and regard. And that's why I wanted to mention that.
네, 년 자식을 가만나 길근 가래 특성 공나바게나 고런 적천나 지금 전부 시기 마이클레 라보레세. 그 파치를 고런 거 지금 적천 또 요사산으로 송도. 근데 다리가 안데 적천 그추 거기나 또 야주다 니모도 말아 잡고 살에 다리. 너 산지점 요 말이세. 땅 오마이나 다리 근데 그런 그 지금 한 신년 사가 실난 직된 공원도 신나야 거기나 리자크고 스르종이나 자크고 스르종데 락상이 차이나 또 랑커가 자나 잡고다니 나 데라 니친 종디온데 거기나 것수 희망 거나나 상위 희망 제기도네 상위 희망도 타커고 저저나 디 니반냠 존데 대동 다 장거 조바 친분도요 지 랑커가 왕양 마톱 대신도 농양 마톱 대신도는 지금 다 뭔가 라속바 체킨즈 뭐요인데 때도 지양 매대는 랑커 거다리 이게다 이게래 파치가 지금 시대잖아 저래다 대 모즈도 로에다는 때니 타커 거저지잖아 하전 인가 진보래 회는 나이나 그거 추강 농아 조ችን 거거리나 담보 농마토 왕마토 거랑 담바 카시 보고매.
In fact, I mention it because it's poignant in my mind, having met someone just a few days before who mentioned that the Dzogchen doctrine was not difficult to comprehend or understand. And because of that, this is something that should be openly spread out. For example, the Nyingtik Yabshi scriptures should be made available for others to read so that they could understand this, as though it were some intellectual study that you could understand just by reading the words of those precious treasuries. Actually, this was quite shocking to me, because anyone who knows anything about Dzogpa Chenpo's tradition knows that it's entirely dependent upon receiving empowerment, reading transmission, pointing out instructions, and commentaries directly from a lineage holding master, accomplishing the 500,000 prerequisite preliminaries, and then and only then is there a hope of actually beginning to study the words of those sacred texts and having an opportunity to understand the pith or the core of their inner meaning. Otherwise, to just take a book off the shelf and read it, anyone can do that. You can read those words, but it's very dangerous if they're misinterpreted and misused in this way. And so that's why we must be very careful, even from a worldly point of view. The secrets of the government are not meant to be openly exposed. The secrets of a patented medicine are not meant to be openly exposed, because there's the danger that this could be, it could lose its potency, it could be misused and become something harmful rather than beneficial. And so just like that, from a spiritual point of view, that's how this tradition always has been, and that's how it needs to be kept. For myself, if I don't have an empowerment or a transmission for a particular Dzogchen scripture, I won't even open the text and look at it.
가리가 삼나 당상이나 디럽 녀스티바레 다리 그 슈초얼 고시코는 오팡 다리 강아였나 카시정나 척래지 디모젠르다 다 디잠글 김슨 나수양 다리가 상목당 게 요래 회나 나수이나 드니 회처시나양 뭔가다나 왕차든 메데 다리 회처 다리 석지가 양간 조금에 대신도 팁 다리 화천시기다나 자르자 같은 건 적이 있나라나 적천 그 출kur차가 쩌다진다 닝고네나 로섬체가 랑아다리가 자나 깡모모고 디모다리 딸퍼시 맘용 되니나 그거 양가리가 지 코로나스 또 요zen다 다 오마 적천 또제다 지 레라 보스 말에 아마 네 금팀 뭐편 잠수 의시 좀마 그감나 떡송오늘에 파고든 개접 체르는기 여러 밥배 납비돈 기마 넘보 여점기 똑버 말라 태좀요 세전제나 문 야그럼 밥배 열거 다리금 쾌바 몽보다나 워 강정 그 정금 쾌바 몽보고 조바 쳔보다나 대전도 셔야 쳔보 라속 비스타반도 이 룸와라까 멈척 시작했는 때니 조 다리 똑너래 당상드나 지금 쾌바 똑개완 가리가 다 뜨벅지니라 하려고 저게다 쿠스똑다 제이다나 다 카홉샤 근득단 다 콩다리 태종요 그제래 당 오면 어초이나야 당상다리 지금 게르근 지금 쇼소소 그 가리다나 lum만 가리 그런 수 있는 지금 다 적천다 흥어 니모츠와 지금 메시지 전부 메커제이 더 참말라 적거지다 당 수산노 당나 메시지면나 그 가서 오게 나왔던 거 드네 자와 소담냠들 쏘빠이다나 다 오니가 지금 마시게 메는즈다 상물 고치스기나 줬다리 그랬더니 남바 소다리 막상나 총내에 막도 되면은 다네 보그 추운데라 드니 야르 따르다 잡줄이 오는 말고 때다리 말을 렁주고 닌카 하청 첨본도
In this 21st century, it is a time when all spiritual traditions and aspects of life are becoming more open, more available. And so we are also thinking in this way. It's not that we are outdated and not willing to join modernity and the process that's occurring on the planet. But when it comes to the traditions of spiritual development, we think and have continued to think just like the masters of the past who have sustained these traditions so that they could be available to us today, that it is crucial to apply practice such as the 5 100,000 accumulation preliminaries as a prerequisite for studying these kinds of advanced texts that deal with the deepest view, the highest and most secret view of Buddha Dharma. That it's not appropriate to read those scriptures and try to understand them basically because they will be misinterpreted. It's also not appropriate to publish them openly so as to spread them in a casual way. And for myself, having been teaching about these subjects for 30 years or more, it's something that I have never even come close to doing, nor will I ever. And so to come to the West and meet some professors who have read a few of the Dzogchen scriptures without any teacher interpreting the meaning to them at all, to say that this is easy to understand and should be spread out because it's so easy others will be able to comprehend this, it is ridiculous. It is ridiculous, as Mipam Rinpoche pointed out, where he said, all masters and scholars in the land of India and Tibet accomplish the ultimate meaning after applying exertion for a long time. Alas, these days the imbeciles will proclaim that they have realization instantly. This gives rise to doubt. And so I really agree with this statement. It gives rise to doubt that anyone is going to be able to propagate any aspect of Dharma with this kind of an approach. In fact, it indicates a direct decline. Because if we look at how hard the great masters of Tibet and India, over centuries of time, the time-tested truth of this wisdom lineage was not easy to accomplish. In Dzogpa Chenpo and in Mahamudra and so forth, these advanced topics, then to claim that none of that makes a difference and to just open up some scriptures because you've learned to read the language and think that you can easily understand it without connecting to any other aspect of the tradition is really totally ridiculous and misguided. So that's ridiculous because it means a few teachers teaching to their students in this way, then this kind of notion is going to spread. And people will begin to believe that these subjects are easy to understand. But rather than spreading the authentic lineages on into the future in the name of modernity, they're going to be actually destroying the authentic lineage in the name of modernity.
네, 아주 적천 그 조다리 추운데 냠랜다 차트시나 다 금치 홍친 바 공고 송악 좋은 정교제. 된나 홍친 바가 초염적 그 레급 적직 비까나 단다 적천의 상위 고가 냠슬라네 남제 톱처 몽송제. 가스 상마도 지잔지 있니나 다 니바 몽범 종제. 체레제나 랑다 잔니까라 다리 노밤종 첸드당 쳄시마 완송던 조조 노밤종 송제. 드네 다리가 가르테 상의 마도지나 추운도 다리 랑조비 년카요 송제. 가르테 ndo 다리 상 문족지 잔 먹상지 잔지 있나 그 추종 종마 탐체가 랑아 그 니체 송송원제. 대신도 추운도 먹상나 랑급 삼돈 탐체 먼저 제. 땅아이나 오네 지금 당리 잔라 판바งู급 마포네 나라나 다 랑아 다리가 지금 추종 종마가 니체 송제다 랑급 삼도 만접나 대양 다리가 짐지경 딱 봐서 말했으면 수랑 종이체 대양 하장 다리가 다 추추샤니나 자가 회듭 답변이는 저 하장다리 독조시고요. 대인이나 저 넘버 2 킬 넘버 길근 차근하는 디모타리 요 말했다나 이나요 닌디 스타와도 더니 다 마온네 끝났더니 차버드 납쇼고 다리 지금 시험 받고 수이다나 콩 넘버라 적고 삼기 다 초라 하장 더니 지금 차버어 가서 ngala 계속 체르제나 당가 다리나 롭점모 스그나 송레다 이나요 지금 당레 콩 넘버 워크 르네텔라 짐직 셰크요는데 하정 이 팝송 체르제나 베근 룰르데 야하즈데 고금만데 마고 진데요 다가 출라 왕자바제 다 추데라 다리가 하정 지금 그 답변이 호스 매용에다나 당 아추이나 하정 춘데란 점바침보다 덕중시기고 그 머리를 랭겐요래 대인나 니원이나 तनी माओ ने कमना तनी दी थादा दारी सोनो मो तांचरे दुजिक गिरगन नंबर सोइना को नंबे तारंगा ना दारी देसो जिमजी हाजन यबो शेक्योरे एक शेक्योरे다 옛나야 근데 쪼진담 탐바즈다 추담 탐바즈 그고 맞추 짐지도 쉐고 마톡제마 추담 몬탐바즈 그 짐지 쉐니 있나 tनी 무이러 자요나 마톡제마 지금 때 여보 용 탑게 말했삼기고 삼스리요.
On this subject, omniscient Longchenpa also points out in the 11th chapter of his Chuying Rinpoche Zut, which is the precious treasury of the Dharmadhatu. And in that chapter, he very eloquently writes about the importance of maintaining the secrecy and the sacredness of the lineage restrictions. And that if that is not observed, that the result of engaging in even any study or interest in this direction will simply never occur. And not only that, he mentions the pitfalls that for those who misuse the tradition and openly expose it inappropriately, then they're going to have repercussions in this and future lifetimes. If the secret nature of the doctrine is lost, then they will be harmed by the Dharma protectors, and they will be unable to accomplish their own goals, let alone the benefit of others. And so for myself, I take these words very seriously, coming from omniscient Longchenpa. Leave aside the notion of benefiting others, which of course is our goal. If I'm going to harm myself and bring the wrath of the protectors upon me for breaking the code of the secret tradition or sullying that code, this is something I should think very carefully about. Why would I ever want to do that? And so that is done by inappropriately giving teachings out of context or publishing texts in a way that it would not be appropriate for others to receive them, disseminating them, and so forth. So I'm not saying that any of you here are responsible for doing this. In fact, you're not. But because I've now had quite a bit of experience in coming to Western universities and seeing how scholars are propagating Buddhist material in colleges, then it's been a grave concern that's been growing, bubbling up inside of me about how the research is being done on the secret material, which is not being done in a qualified way. And those scholars need to know this. Someone needs to tell them. There's nothing wrong with researching. That's how we educate ourselves. But in terms of Buddhist studies, there are certain aspects of the studies that can be researched openly and other aspects that need to be researched according to the lineage requirements. And that needs to be respected. And we need to be very careful to take responsibility for these lineages that we're interested in and eager about educating ourselves and others. And so until now, I haven't really spoken out that much, but now I intend to really make it be known because I do see it as a problem, and I have quite a concern because this will not bring any good results.
다 직도더니 소 더니 조바 침보에 나자 상담바에 나자 소노 마초 다 셈라스라 테 네 라라 소소 또 get비 라미 망가서 고난자가 소르긴거 더니 차차다도 시나 더니 셈라테이나 다 셈고 모든 통나 더니 조칭 그까나 야 조칭 그 더니 다 셈통나 상계 연벌다리 상계벌인 게로 송고지 아니 다 상품 받은 거좀 타고 나나요 셈기고 통데 다리 센터 상계제이다 그냥 좀 뭔가 갑나 때 송고요지 또 지금 장거 종국 마와수이나 때 슬라보즈 마레제이다 그바 통고요다 옛날에 그런 좀 높아가 다리가 당아수 칠레바제라 그러나 네 무큼을 바가 칠레바가 다리가 나돈도 잠바수 다리 마고 와진다나 근데 추가 냠렘 바수 근데 다가 송력 때나 다가 지금 잠바고 짐직수 나발은 먼저 앉아서 요래다 요나요 때 지금 다리 겸상 잠바래 때니나 다가 남바수 짐직쉐나 실동ning 아주 저 당럽거 다리 짐직 다가 탑슬 남바 나속시다 샤파 겸나요 저게 다 뛰는 거요 적친다는 상등지긴데 소다리 셈무 같은 거 잡으면 제일 고지들에 막도 되면은 지금 종류 권하즈다 소파 권하즈가 tani hajan skanare tenina ngatsu dari ga khoirna dari khung so an zero laron ngar na ton lola laron gan zen jona zukchen gar kora dari ga ta zu nyamlen gar go nyamsum nyong ji ma to zemana ji stopa ga shapa jer yogo dari stocha ga na yong zukchen sto chokon mar sto me chok jeto sto te la ji styun zyo da ko ba ji ba yo mar dana yena yong ta ji 룰그 망가 걸고 냠슬란 지기나 띠똥고 용제래 대나 지금 로차 전부 마오 내급나 되네 지금 적친 걸고도 소이나 조 랑가 냠슬래야 막도 되면은 지금 당상 종 전부 지금 그저데 또가 다리가 샤좀 거지다나 또가 몽은 행는 거든 땡에 때나 구바마가 맞죠 야나가 있나 된다 지가 다리가 코란서 이 다리가 약주시금에 대나 너쇼고 있나 다리 개반난 받순데 다리가 지금도 도는 시로 tani nisi taka chi rangoni dani ga yewa shir gona nge tena dani garwaz mare garwa mare tana yang nyamnyung gur gone shat gona makto zemana chingda thakar ga jong gur gone tari job gone na lorgi gar tang sopa rong zre te tera na taga ngasu dari job gona ka more da kan tari ni na taga ris ma chepa taga gomba yermet tari job to sta yo jigda samala trashi de loje.
So finally, then, in terms of the two great traditions, the Dzogchen and the Chen, mainly these two traditions are similar in that they're both watching or emphasizing mind's nature and the introspection into what that nature is. And in doing so, both traditions teach that if one sees the mind's nature, there will be Buddhahood in that lifetime. That's taught in Dzogpa Chenpo. Seeing mind's nature means becoming awakened. That's taught in Chen Buddhism. Seeing mind's nature brings Buddhahood in a single lifetime. And those are the teachings that we find in the great scriptures of both of these traditions. And so the intellectuals will refute this notion, claiming that it's not that easy. And of course, that is because they are emphasizing the gradualist approach, and when one is actually emphasizing reference to just seeing mind's nature to attain Buddhahood, then that is emphasizing the contemplative approach of meditative placement as opposed to analytical investigation. And so there are these different reasons for emphasizing one or the other, and they're certainly not going to be concurrent. But that's why there are many methods that we find across the board for understanding how to practice, but that these practices must be understood within their respective systems. And so that's why when it comes to identifying mind's nature, the main emphasis for that are these two traditions of Dzogpa Chenpo and Chen. And that means not debating or analyzing anything at the time of observing mind's nature. At Larangar, the monastic academy, then that's also the main emphasis, because what we emphasize there is practice. We're not necessarily emphasizing analytical meditation, debate, or reasoning as much as we are certainly in the context of Dzogpa Chenpo analyzing practice. And there's no need to, the fact that there's no need to debate this tradition or analyze it is not because we're trying to cover a fault, but that it's because that's the nature of the tradition. I hope I've made that point clear. And that if one connects with this lineage and is instructed by a lineage holding master, then that disciple will be instructed in the correct way of approaching the practice, and therefore they will understand how to proceed. And so that is how it should be. That's how we are emphasizing the Dzogchen practice in our monastic academy. And if there's any other way of relating to the Dzogchen tradition in China other than that, then I'm not going to support that, just like I'm not supporting that here in terms of the academies where there might be general research going on about Dzogchen, as I've already made reference to. And so it's my point of view that one needs to be impartial about all traditions and respect them all, but to keep respect in terms of how they're meant to be understood and practiced, because you know them and you're not trying to interpret them according to your own needs. So thank you very much.